two of Hollywood's most glamorous women found themselves repeatedly chasing the same spotlight, the same coveted roles, and sometimes even the same men. Now 92, Joan Collins has spoken more candidly than ever about her long, complicated history with Elizabeth Taylor's story shaped by fame, jealousy, betrayal, and a rivalry sparked by a crown meant for Cleopatra. Collins had been all but promised the role until the studio handed it to Taylor, a decision that altered both of their careers forever. What followed was a tangled mix of competition, missed opportunities, turbulent relationships, and, unexpectedly, moments of genuine connection. The truth Collins now shares about Taylor is far more nuanced than the headlines ever suggested, and it leaves lingering questions even today. In the early 1960s, Collins had every reason to believe Cleopatra would be hers. She was under contract with 20th Century Fox and already begun preparing for what was poised to be one of Hollywood's most ambitious productions. Still, in her late 20s, she was stunning, charismatic, and widely viewed as a perfect fit for the legendary queen. Insiders assumed her career was about to reach astonishing new heights. But Hollywood had a way of reminding its stars that nothing, not even a nearly signed contract, was guaranteed. Elizabeth Taylor, already one of the most famous women in the world and a two-time Oscar winner, made it clear she wanted the role. The studio's priorities shifted overnight. Fox executives, dazzled by Taylor's box office power, offered her a record-breaking $1 million salary, the highest ever paid to an actress at the time. For Collins, who had been on the brink of a career-defining triumph, the news was crushing. Losing Cleopatra wasn't just a business decision. It left an emotional mark. The film itself became notorious not only for its extravagant sets and runaway budget, but for the explosive romance between Taylor and Richard Burton that began during production. Their affair dominated global headlines and transformed Taylor into a cultural phenomenon. Meanwhile, Collins could only watch as the role that might have reshaped her career instead cemented Taylor's legendary status. Years later, Collins admitted that the hurt went beyond losing a part. It felt like losing ground in a lifelong race for recognition and respect in a male-dominated industry, one where Taylor seemed to embody everything Collins had been told she was destined for: beauty, influence, and the adoration of millions. To the world, Taylor was a goddess. To Collins, she was a rival who always seemed half a step ahead. And Cleopatra was only the beginning. Not long after losing Cleopatra, Collins found herself entangled with the very man who had once brought darkness into Elizabeth Taylor's life. What unfolded was far more shocking, more personal, and more damaging than any lost film role. If Cleopatra felt like a professional betrayal, this next encounter with Taylor's shadow cut into Collins's private world in a way she had never expected. This time the rivalry wasn't about contracts or casting decisions. It was about a man Conrad Nikki Hilton Jr., heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune and Elizabeth Taylor's first husband. Taylor had married him in 1950 at just 18. To the world, they seemed like a dream pairing, Hollywood's young princess and American royalty. But behind closed doors, Taylor endured a marriage marred by Nikki's drinking, gambling, and violent temper. The union lasted barely 8 months, leaving emotional wounds she carried for years. Decades later, Collins stepped unknowingly into the same storm. After Hilton's split from Taylor, Collins began seeing him, swept up at first by his charm and status, but the glamour quickly dissolved. In her memoir, she describes chilling moments that revealed just how dangerous he could be. One night after an argument, Hilton allegedly pulled out a gun and fired a shot into the ceiling while she lay in bed. It was a terrifying rupture of reality, exposing the instability that lurked beneath his polished exterior to the public. Hilton was still the handsome, troubled playboy, but to both Taylor and Collins, he was a source of chaos that wealth couldn't hide. Collins couldn't help seeing the painful parallels. She wasn't only following Taylor's footsteps on screen, she was experiencing the same emotional turmoil Taylor had once fought to escape. Being tied to the same man added a deeply personal sting to a rivalry that had already begun to simmer. Collins later admitted that the connection felt almost cruel, as though fate had bound her to relive Taylor's past. While Taylor had severed ties with Hilton quickly, Collins stayed longer, hoping his temper would change and his promises would finally hold true. Instead, she found herself trapped in a cycle of upheaval that threatened her emotional stability and even her rising career too. Audiences watching from afar seeing only flawless gowns, red carpet smiles, and carefully curated glamours. The idea that two of Hollywood's brightest stars were linked by such a destructive man would have seemed unimaginable. But it was real, and it left marks on both of their lives. As Collins finally pulled away from Hilton, she couldn't shake the feeling that Taylor's shadow still lingered over her life. But Hollywood rarely moves in straight lines. Rivals can become allies, enemies can find common ground, and comparisons once sharpened by envy can soften into something far more unexpected. That's exactly what happened when Collins and Taylor crossed paths again years later, this time not as competitors, but as co-stars. For decades, Collins and Taylor were linked in the public imagination. Both were striking London-born brunettes, both pursued the same coveted roles, and both carried the magnetic glamour of classic Hollywood. Gossip columnists thrived on the idea of rivalry, casting Taylor as untouchable Hollywood royalty, the violet-eyed icon who could sway entire studios, while Collins was framed as the fiery contender, dazzling but forever playing catch-up. Their supposed tension became a narrative, so irresistible that it seemed destined to last forever, but Hollywood loves reinvention. By the late 1990s, both women had endured the dizzying highs and punishing lows of stardom. Taylor had weathered a string of divorces, incessant scrutiny over her appearance, and serious health crises that repeatedly landed her in the hospital. Collins had reinvented herself spectacularly in the 1980s, commanding the screen as Alexis Carrington on Dynasty and proving she was far more than the actress who almost became Cleopatra. They were no longer ingenues forced into comparison. They were legends, admired as much for their resilience as for their beauty. With age came clarity, and the old rivalry lost its bite as each woman recognized how much they had actually shared. Their true moment of reconciliation came in 2001, when they agreed to star together in the television comedy These Old Broads. On the surface, it was a light-hearted movie about aging actresses maneuvering through Hollywood's chaos. In reality, it was a symbolic reunion. Collins-Taylor, Shirley MacLaine, and Debbie Reynolds, for icons who had shaped an era. For Collins and Taylor, it was more than a role. It was a public truce. After decades of whispered friction, the irony was unmistakable. Two women once pitted against each other by studios and tabloids now stood side by side, poking fun at the very industry that had fueled their supposed feud. On set, Collins found herself surprised by Taylor. Beneath the legendary diamonds and air of untouchable glamour, Taylor was warm, funny, self-deprecating, and vulnerable. She was nothing like the aloof rival Collins had spent years imagining. Instead, she was a survivor, someone who had confronted loss, ridicule, and overwhelming public attention, yet managed to maintain her kindness. As they worked together, a genuine friendship emerged. Collins later spoke of Taylor with real affection, praising her humor, her generosity, and her ability to remain gracious despite the relentless scrutiny she had faced since childhood. And for Taylor, who had battled illness, heartbreak, and the isolating weight of superstardom, Collins may have offered a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. Both women had lived under the same harsh spotlight, endured the same pressures, and carried the same scars. Both women had known heartbreak, and both had been forced to fight for longevity in an industry that often discards actresses the moment their youth begins to fade. While These Old Broads wasn't a ratings phenomenon, its cultural impact far outweighed its viewership. Audiences weren't just watching a comedy, they were witnessing a reconciliation. After decades of being cast as opponents, Collins and Taylor appeared side by side, finding common ground and subtly reminding the world that tabloids rarely tell the full story. For once, they were not competing. They were allies, laughing together on screen, and reclaiming the narrative that had defined them for so long. Still, even as their friendship grew, Collins wasn't about to let Hollywood off the hook. In later interviews, memoirs, and her documentary, This is Joan Collins. She began stripping away the golden veneer, exposing the darker truths beneath the glamour. She spoke candidly about the treacherous path that she and Taylor had both been forced to navigate, an industry rife with manipulation, predatory executives, and relentless pressure to conform. For much of her career, Joan Collins had been presented to the public as a woman who had it all: beauty, sophistication, fame, and success. Her image was polished to perfection: magazine covers, elegant gowns, and high-profile romances. But when she began to tell her own story, a much harsher reality emerged. Beneath Hollywood's glitter was a system that demanded silence and compliance, especially from ambitious young women. Collins revealed that studio executives had propositioned her early in her career, openly expecting sexual favors in exchange for roles. When she refused, the blowback was swift. She was labeled difficult, her opportunities dwindled, and roles that once seemed within reach quietly vanished. She even recalled one producer bluntly telling her, "If you do not play the game, you will not get the part." Her refusal made her a target in an environment where the casting couch was an open secret. Elizabeth Taylor, meanwhile, may have seemed protected by fame, but she too was trapped within the suffocating grip of the studio system. Even as one of Hollywood's biggest stars before she turned 25, she lived under constant supervision. Studios dictated her public image, orchestrated who she should date, crafted glossy narratives that left little room for personal freedom. Her life became a carefully choreographed performance, with every decision scrutinized and repackaged for the audience. When real scandal pierced that manufactured faca de most, famously her torrid affair with Richard Burton during the making of Cleopatra, the industry that had built her up suddenly turned against her. Newspapers that once worshipped her now branded her a homewrecker. But Taylor refused to crumble. Instead, she powered through the backlash with defiance. When studios attempted to punish her, she raised her asking price and shattered precedents. When tabloids tried to shame her, she gave them even bigger stories, appearing in lavish jewels from Burton, showing up at events on her own terms, and refusing to apologize for her life. She transformed scandal into leverage. Mastering the system that had tried to tear her apart, Collins often spoke of her admiration for Taylor's determination during those years. Despite their former rivalry, she saw the extraordinary strength it took for Taylor to withstand such vicious scrutiny. And in that strength, Collins recognized something familiar: her own resilience. Shaped by battles just as bruising, fought behind the same shimmering Hollywood curtain. She had refused to bow to the casting couch. She had survived being dismissed, underestimated, and constantly compared to Elizabeth Taylor in ways that framed her as the eternal runner-up. Yet she rose again most spectacularly with dynasty, proving she could reinvent herself even when Hollywood thought her career was finished. Still, survival left marks. Collins later admitted that her unwillingness to compromise may have cost her Cleopatra and other roles that could have redefined her career. She acknowledged that Taylor's willingness to fight, no matter how much scandal it created, helped make her a symbol of independence. Together, their experiences exposed the cracks in Hollywood's machinery long before the industry was ready to reckon with its own abuses. That shared battle forged an unspoken bond between Collins and Taylor. They were no longer rivals. They were veterans of a hidden war, women who had fought private battles as dramatic as anything they portrayed on screen. And when Collins began putting her truth into writing, she made it clear that the Hollywood of their youth was far more ruthless than the glossy studio portraits suggested. Her honesty didn't end with her documentary. In her later memoirs, she peeled back the curtain even further, revealing new stories about Taylor, their rivalry, and the dangerous, glittering world they had both endured. Those revelations added yet another unexpected twist to their intertwined saga. For decades, Collins kept much of her rivalry with Taylor hidden behind charm and elegance. She smiled on red carpets, delivered clever sound bites, and rarely let her real feelings show. But as time passed, she grew more willing to speak plainly. In her memoirs, especially Behind the Shoulder Pads, Tales I Only Tell, my friend she abandons the old Hollywood politeness and recounts events as she truly remembers them. Even when the memories sting, Collins admits that Taylor always seemed to have the upper hand on screen, in the press, and sometimes even in their personal lives. She wrote openly about the heartbreak of losing Cleopatra, making it clear that the role haunted her long after Taylor claimed it. She also discussed feeling as though Taylor didn't just overshadow her professionally, but sometimes romantically as well. Nikki Hilton was the most painful example. But Collins hinted at other moments when Taylor's beauty and aura drew attention away from her. Intentionally or not, she was careful not to frame these feelings as hatred. Instead, she described the experience as a persistent frustration, living in the shadow of someone whose fame was so colossal it distorted everything around it. Collins also emphasized how Hollywood thrived on fueling such rivalries. Tabloid culture in the 1950s and 60s adored the idea of Collins versus Taylor, branding one the British beauty and the other the Queen of Hollywood. Even when the women weren't feuding, the press insisted they were. Collins admitted she occasionally played into this narrative, offering sharp remarks in interviews, but later recognized that both she and Taylor had been trapped by the same myth. Yet, Collins still gave her readers exactly the kind of stories the old tabloids would have devoured. She described her turbulent relationship with Hilton, drawing stark similarities to Taylor's own experiences with him. She recounted Hollywood parties where Taylor commanded the room simply by walking into it. She wrote about the diamonds, the couture, and the extravagant lifestyle that made Taylor an icon of glamour and how, at times, Collins felt like she was forever chasing the same spotlight, told with her signature dry wit. The anecdotes reveal not only the rivalry, but how deeply personal it had been for her, shaped by ambition, admiration, frustration, and the strange fate that kept tying their lives together. What makes Collins's memoirs so compelling is not the gossip, but the honesty. She admitted her envy. She confessed her regrets. She acknowledged the times when bitterness clouded her judgment. In doing so, she offered a more human, nuanced portrait of Elizabeth Taylor than the one-dimensional goddess Hollywood had created. To Collins, Taylor was not merely a rival, but a flawed, captivating, fiercely determined woman who made mistakes, took risks, and lived boldly on her own terms. By putting these reflections into print, Collins gave readers something they had never truly seen before. The private thoughts of a woman who had once lived in Taylor's shadow, yet eventually discovered her own brilliance. And as she looked back, she made it clear that their story was never just about rivalry. It was about survival, resilience, and the complicated respect that only grows after a lifetime under the spotlight. Collins's reflections extended well beyond personal grievances. Ultimately, she wanted people to understand the larger truth hidden within her rivalry with Taylor, a lesson about power, envy, and redemption that transcended Hollywood. Seen with the clarity of hindsight, the story of Joan Collins and Elizabeth Taylor reads like a Hollywood epic in its own right. It had everything: glittering triumphs, painful disappointments, tangled romances, and unexpected reconciliation. It began with Cleopatra, the role Collins believed would cement her legacy. It's only for Taylor to claim it and transform it into one of the most iconic performances in film history. Their rivalry deepened when both women found themselves tied to the same volatile man, Nikki Hilton, whose charm concealed a capacity for violence that left lasting scars. For years, the press fed on their supposed feud, painting them as eternal opposites locked in a never-ending battle for Hollywood's crown. But time has a way of softening even the deepest wounds. By the time Collins and Taylor appeared together in these old broads, they were no longer young women vying for attention. They were veterans of an industry that demanded everything and repaid them unevenly. Both had been adored and betrayed, celebrated and scrutinized. In that shared experience, Collins came to understand something unexpected. Taylor was not simply the woman who took Cleopatra. She was someone who had endured as much pain, pressure, and scrutiny as she had. Their mutual resilience formed a bridge that slowly erased decades of bitterness. In her later memoirs, Collins admitted what she had never voiced at the height of their rivalry. She envied Taylor. She felt overshadowed by her staggering fame. But alongside that envy was deep admiration for Taylor's wit, her warmth, her generosity, and her ability to withstand relentless public judgment without losing her fire. To Collins, the truth about Elizabeth Taylor was never the myth of an untouchable goddess draped in diamonds. The truth was far more powerful. Taylor was a woman who fought back against an industry determined to control her. Just as Collins had fought in her own way, their story is a reminder that rivalry doesn't always end in hatred. Sometimes it becomes respect. Sometimes it forces a person to confront insecurities reflected back at them in someone else. And sometimes, with age, it transforms into understanding. At 92, Collins no longer hides behind Hollywood illusion. She admits the envy, the wounds, and the admiration all at once, peeling back the myths to reveal the humanity beneath the glamour. In the end, the tale of Collins and Taylor is not about who won or lost, but about how both women survived. Fame fades, scandals are forgotten, but the human truths, jealousy, perseverance, forgiveness are what remain. And in that truth lies the real surprise. Their rivalry was never just about Cleopatra, or men, or headlines. It was about two extraordinary women who carved their names into history and eventually learned to honor one another for it.